Hi, dear friends, some words of Torah for Parshat Re'eh. The most creative minds are also the most tortured minds. Show me a gifted artist, and I'll show you a person whose life is in turmoil and inner conflict. Whether it's Beethoven, Hemingway, or Van Gogh, the artist's life is filled with painful friction that produces beautiful music, prose, or images. Is that to suggest that without internal conflict, it's impossible to produce the same kind of beauty and expression? Of course, the happy and content individual can still see the beauty in the world and find expression for it, but one is not driven to express it as strongly as the one who cannot find peace until he or she brings expression to the pain. One who has found inner peace may have the same latent talent, but may not feel a need to express it in the same way. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi was thus not impressed by those of other religions who seemed to be more devout in their religious fervor than Jews were in theirs. He noted that someone who lacks a sense of confidence about who they are and what they are doing will feel a need to find a more pronounced way of unleashing that insecurity and angst. And just to quote from the Kuzari, he said, people who use philosophy and logic to derive religious practice seem to strive harder than those who serve God with commanded law. The latter are at peace in that they have a received tradition of divine service. They have confidence in what they do and see no need to arm themselves against any dissenters. They're just like someone who strolls through a secure, fortified city. Those who philosophize, on the other hand, are like someone walking through the desert. He doesn't know what he will encounter and therefore must arm himself with weapons and be well prepared for battle. Don't be swayed by their fervor, nor should you be discouraged by the relaxed attitude of those who have a received tradition. The former have sought fortresses with which to protect themselves, while the latter lie peacefully on their beds in a city long ago fortified. End quote. The Torah addresses the need for greater religious expression when the individual is unsettled. Moshe expressed to the nation that there will be different outlets for spiritual devotion depending upon the time in which one lives. There used to be a sacrificial practice called bamot, whereby a worshiper could build his own altar and bring the animal of his choice as a form of individual expression of divine devotion. Moshe explained to the people that once you enter the land, it will be acceptable for each person to offer a sacrifice on his own bama, but only temporarily. Once the national sanctuaries have been erected, it will be necessary to eliminate bamot and to instead bring one's sacrifices only to the temple. Moshe expressed this and by saying that once the temple is erected, you will no longer have bamot. However, now, kilovatem ad ata. Now, however, you may offer on bamot since you have not yet arrived el hamenucha ve'el hanachala, at the inner peace and control asher Hashem Elokecha noten lach, that Hashem your Lord will give you. The sages teach that bamot were only permitted during those limited periods before we had conquered and settled the land. After that point, a permanent mishkan, a tabernacle, was erected in the city of Shiloh. Once the mishkan was destroyed and before Solomon's temple was built, bamot were re-allowed for a few decades, 57 years to be exact. Then when the temple was built, bamot were forever banned. The Torah deliberately calls the Mishkan and the temple respectively as menucha and nachala, inner peace and control. The text is explaining why bamot were permitted temporarily. The unsettled mind needs to find an expression for its personal tensions and inner conflicts. Bringing a private bama sacrifice was sanctioned during that period of unsettledness because Hashem saw that we would need to express ourselves more during our periods of disharmony and turmoil. But once you arrive at inner peace and control, you'll be able to handle a more curtailed and directed form of worship in the designated places of worship for the entire people. When it comes to personal artistic expression, Jews are as unsettled and angst-ridden as anyone else, maybe even more. When it comes to spiritual outlets, the more confidence the Jewish people have in our peoplehood and our place in the world, the more contentment we can find in the way we live our lives. When the Mishkan was erected in Shiloh and stood for over 3 centuries, it was not the permanent temple, but at least it provided that sense of inner peace. It represented a certain degree of having arrived and reached our destination. That is why the Torah calls it the place of menucha, our place of peacefulness. No different from the term we use for our Shabbat experience, Shabbat menucha, relaxing with the security that all our work is completed and we have some breathing space. But the even greater level of being settled was when the temple was built in Jerusalem. Not only did this represent arriving at our final spiritual destination, the place that could finally be built into a permanent edifice, but also represented full spiritual completeness, our own control, so to speak. For this reason, more restrictions are listed in the Talmud as to how one consumes the sacrifices in Jerusalem versus how one consumes them in Shiloh, the place of the temporary Mishkan. The more one arrives at inner peace, the less necessary it is to provide an outlet for personal religious expression. This may be why our sages express this idea that there will be an absolution of certain mitzvot once the Mashiach arrives. During that utopian future, mitzvah observance may be even more limited because of the spiritual harmony that we will have arrived at due to our greater feelings of closeness to real spirituality. In this vein, we note that so many religious practices over the centuries have been institutionalized, set in stone, and done in a public setting, especially when it comes to prayer. One could argue, could I not find an even greater amount of kavanah, of concentration, and religious expression by davening in my own words, in the privacy of my own home, away from others? Why can't I be myself and converse freely with God? There is certainly truth to this sentiment. At least a portion of every person's daily prayer should be in his or her own words, expressing one's deepest hopes and needs for the future. At the same time, institutional prayer is an expression of the inner peace that we have found over the centuries, a confidence that our religion contains the beauty and majesty of God and the great minds of his tzaddikim through the centuries. As we bless the new month of Elul, let's try to return back to our shuls and daven together. Creating a more regimented prayer system is not a limitation, but rather the higher form of religious expression. And so, dear friends, may we attain the truest sense of menucha and nachala, inner peace and control in our own lives. Bimheira b'yameinu, amen. Here's wishing you a beautiful Shabbos, Shabbat Shalom, and Chodesh Tov.